Paris, March 1943. The night hangs low over the city, heavy with the hum of occupation, boots on cobblestones, distant truck engines, and the faint rattle of typewriter keys drifting from upper-floor windows. Inside a narrow, dimly lit apartment on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis, a woman sits alone at a wooden desk. A single lamp glows over her hands. Before her rests a broken German typewriter, its carriage cracked, its alignment slightly skewed, its ribbon frayed to threads. To any officer, it would look like nothing more than discarded office scrap, but to her, it is something else entirely. She presses one key, then another. The machine does not print clean lines. Instead, each keystroke produces a faint electrical pulse that runs through a thin, hidden wire she has spliced into the building's shared teleprinter junction. A junction used by Nazi field officers. A junction she has been studying for months. Tonight, one misrouted message, just one, could alter troop movements on the outskirts of Paris. Her fingers hover. Her heartbeat steadies. And in that still moment, she decides that information, not bullets, will be her weapon. What led her to this desk, this night, and this fragile machine becomes clearer when we step back into the world she lived in. In early 1943, Europe's war was fought not only with tanks, artillery, and bombers, but increasingly with wires, long, thin veins of copper stretched beneath streets, across fields, through buildings, and between command posts. Every order, every convoy schedule, every security sweep moved along these lines. Germany's occupation machine depended on them far more than most soldiers in the field ever realized. In Paris, the Wehrmacht, Gestapo, and Sicherheitsdienst all maintained their own layered communications networks. Some used radio. Many relied on couriers. But the most consistent, least suspicious traffic passed through civilian teleprinter exchanges, including the French posts, Télégraphes et Téléphones, PTT, whose offices had been forced into German service. The occupiers trusted these networks because they were stable, fast, and staffed by people trained long before the war. They also trusted them because they believed the population had been beaten into submission. But the reality behind those quiet exchanges was different. Hundreds of French employees worked under watchful German supervision, yet a portion of them were already feeding information to the resistance, the BCRA, or to local intelligence cells aligned with London. The Germans knew sabotage was a possibility, but they expected dynamite, not teleprinter tricks, and they believed the technical complexity of their systems offered a natural shield. Still, the occupation strained even those systems. German field offices around Paris often lacked enough approved teleprinters and replacement parts. Their dependence on local repair workshops, many of which employed both French and foreign technicians, created gaps, small ones, but large enough for a patient mind to slip through. The woman at the center of this story stepped into these gaps. She worked under the guise of a part-time clerk, one of the thousands who kept civilian offices functioning despite shortages and requisitions. Her assigned duties were mundane: sorting cables, processing mechanical faults, routing malfunctioning units to overburdened repair depots. She was quiet, reliable, and almost invisible, a quality that gave her more freedom than anyone suspected. Through her daily tasks, she learned which lines were busiest, which offices carried military packets, and which desks were used for routine German traffic. She discovered that certain switch points, especially in older Paris buildings, still relied on shared teleprinter junctions, relics from before the war that had never been fully modernized. These shared lines were typically marked for replacement, but remained operational because engineers had more urgent repairs to complete. In a world of rigid military structure, shared infrastructure was a vulnerability. Signals officers feared radio interception more than wire infiltration. They used codes, ciphers, and routing discipline to protect wireless transmissions, but teleprinter cables inside urban buildings were considered safe by default. Wires ran behind walls and under floors, tucked away from view, guarded mostly by the assumption that civilians lacked the technical expertise to interfere without detection. She did not. Before the war, she had trained as a stenographer and office mechanic, skills unremarkable on their own but invaluable when combined. She understood typewriters intimately, the alignment of their keys, the tensions of their springs, the electrical pickups in models adapted for auxiliary circuits. When a German field office discarded a broken machine with a damaged carriage rail, she recognized potential, not waste. The typewriter's internal wiring could mimic teleprinter impulses when modified correctly. Not perfectly, not with the precision of a military telex, but closely enough to exploit certain junctions that interpreted simple pulses as routing signals. These signals didn't need to rewrite entire messages. They could redirect them, flag them for duplication, or nudge them into parallel channels. She studied the machine quietly over several weeks. No explosives, no grand sabotage, just patient observation of how the occupiers handled their equipment, where they stored repaired parts, and how often they inspected civilian desks. The Germans rarely checked personal apartments unless tipped off. A broken machine taken home for practice or to salvage parts hardly attracted notice. Her work expanded outward from the typewriter itself. She traced the wiring inside her building, noting who used which lines and when. She listened to the hum of signal traffic and learned its rhythms. During curfews, when the city rested under blackout and silence, she tested impulses through the modified machine, watching tiny fluctuations in the junction's response. This was the patient, unseen front of resistance, not dramatic firefights, but adjustments measured in millimeters and milliseconds. By February 1943, she understood enough to attempt her first small manipulation. Not a hijacking, just a diversion of non-critical traffic to study reaction times. No alarms sounded. No German officer appeared at her door. The network barely registered the shift. It was then she realized the scale of what might be possible. But to understand why her actions mattered, and why the Germans never anticipated someone like her, we must look more closely at the environment she operated in, the pressures on occupied France, and the networks that kept both sides alive. Her world was built on contradictions, silence and danger, routine and surveillance, invisibility and risk. Paris in 1943 outwardly appeared stable under German control. Shops opened, workers traveled. Trams rattled across the Seine, but beneath that veneer, tension lived in every breath of the city. The occupation did not need loud intimidation, it relied on constant pressure. Checkpoints, curfews, identity inspections, a sense that any misstep, any suspicious glance could draw unwanted attention. Telecommunications offices were at the center of this tension. The Germans depended on them, but they did not fully trust them. Every PTT building had German guards posted at the entrance. Inside, a mix of French and German supervisors monitored the staff. A misrouted cable might be dismissed as a mistake. A pattern of irregularities could lead to interrogations. Some clerks had already disappeared after inspection teams claimed to find evidence of sabotage. No one returned from such investigations. These pressures meant that even honest errors could feel like acts of rebellion. And for someone intentionally working behind the facade of routine, the stakes were life and death. The woman, quiet, meticulous, and known for her calm demeanor, did her best to remain unremarkable. She arrived early, she left late. She spoke little, listened much, and observed everything. Her reliability earned her the trust of both French colleagues and the German officers overseeing her section. This trust allowed her to access malfunctioning machinery and to take home broken equipment for spare parts or practice repairs. Few questioned it. The occupation prized efficiency, and a clerk who reduced repair backlog was a convenience worth keeping. Outside the office, the resistance worked in fragments. Cells often functioned independently to protect one another. The WWII in London struggled to maintain secure lines with groups inside Paris. Courier routes were constantly disrupted. Radio operators risked RDF detection. Every message carried a cost. For intelligence workers trapped inside occupied networks, the challenge wasn't just transmitting information, it was surviving long enough to transmit it at all. She was not an official member of any group at first. Her involvement began informally, through a friend who quietly passed details about German patrol patterns to the resistance. The woman's role, however, expanded when local operatives noticed her familiarity with teleprinters. They didn't ask for sabotage, they asked only for observation. What systems were the Germans using? How were messages routed? Could she track patterns without drawing attention? She agreed, and in doing so, stepped onto a path that would demand precision beyond anything she had trained for. Much of her early information was small but valuable. She identified which lines were prioritized during emergencies, which offices handled Wehrmacht field reports, which German desks relied on old French teleprinters rather than modern Lawrence or Siemens models. These details helped the resistance avoid detection during their own transmissions. They also revealed vulnerabilities, poorly supervised switching stations, unguarded maintenance closets, and shared building junctions. But the most significant discovery came not from office work, but from her own apartment building. Constructed before World War I, it still used a central wiring trunk that connected residential lines to a wider district network. Years earlier, some units had been converted for teleprinter compatibility, but the upgrades were inconsistent. One junction in the basement, overlooked, dusty, half-forgotten, still carried mixed traffic, including low-priority German dispatches routed through civilian pathways. That junction became her target. The challenge was not access. The building's residents stored bicycles and boxes in the same basement room. The challenge was understanding how impulses traveled through that shared line, and how much influence a modified typewriter could exert without triggering alarms in German switchboards. She documented everything quietly, timing intervals, signal strengths, the delay between an outgoing packet and the confirmation pulse. She tested at night, when the building was silent, when no footsteps crossed the stairwell. She worked with a methodical patience that mirrored the disciplined world she lived in. Outside her personal efforts, the war grew more complex. Germany tightened control over French industry. The Gestapo increased raids. Intelligence agencies demanded clearer signal security. Every telegraph office was scrutinized more intensely, and yet the Germans still relied on the very systems they distrusted. They could not replace them all. They could barely maintain the networks they had. This tension, dependency without security, was the key to everything she would later do. For her, the question was no longer whether she could observe German traffic, but whether she could intervene in it without detection. The broken typewriter on her desk held the answer, its internal components offering a means to generate crude routing pulses, not enough to forge messages, not enough to write entire lines of text, but enough to alter paths, redirect copies, and quietly flag messages for duplication. Small movements, but in a war defined by information, small movements could shift entire operations. Her path was set, and the German communications network was far more fragile than it appeared. How she used that fragility would unfold through several angles, human, tactical, technological, and moral, that shaped her story. The most striking aspect of her story is how ordinary her life appeared. She was not a trained spy, not a soldier, not someone who had sought danger before the war. Her world had once been composed of routine, office keys, typed reports, small repairs, and quiet evenings spent reading under a lamp. Yet occupation has a way of dissolving the boundary between ordinary life and silent resistance. For many Parisians, the war arrived not through explosions, but through incremental intrusions. Ration lines, patrols, seized buildings, and the sudden expectation that one must cooperate. Her decision to intervene emerged from a slow accumulation of pressures rather than a single dramatic moment. Each confiscated typewriter, each German order processed through her hands, each colleague questioned by the Gestapo, each whispered conversation about raids, arrests, and families torn apart. These formed the emotional soil in which resistance took root, not anger alone, but an understanding that her technical skills gave her an unusual opportunity. Her strength lay not in boldness, but endurance. She could sit for hours studying the faint fluctuations in a signal line, adjusting the tension of a typewriter spring 1 millimeter at a time. She could mask fear behind predictable habits. She learned the art of invisibility, moving through her workplace with a calm, steady rhythm that created no suspicion. While armed resistance, fighters risked firefights. She fought a quieter battle where one misplaced tool or mistimed pulse could mean death. Her human angle reveals a simple truth. Wars often rely on people who never intended to be heroes, yet find themselves positioned where a small action carries enormous weight. She became one of them, an invisible combatant woven into the fabric of everyday life. And as her internal resolve sharpened, another angle came into focus: the tactical battlefield of urban communications. To most, Paris was a city of cafes, trams, wide boulevards and checkpoints, but beneath this visible world ran a far more critical landscape: the communications grid. Telephone and teleprinter cables snaked through walls, across rooftops, under pavement stones, through conduits older than many of the soldiers guarding them. The Germans inherited this labyrinth and attempted to reorganize it for military efficiency. They added secure lines where they could, but relied heavily on existing French infrastructure. This created a tactical paradox. Radio was faster but dangerous. The Allies improved interception and direction finding. German operators risked exposing entire units with a single careless transmission, so field officers preferred cable traffic whenever possible, considering it secure by default, but cables remained vulnerable precisely because they were quiet. No antenna, no broadcast footprint, no obvious signature. Sabotage could go unnoticed, hidden among technical glitches. The tactical battlefield she operated on wasn't a street or a front line. It was a junction box in a basement, where bundles of labeled and unlabeled wires merged into a single trunk. The Germans relied on it without fully understanding its condition, and the French technicians assigned to maintain it lacked the authority to modernize it. That junction carried mixed traffic: civilian notes, business correspondence, and low-priority German packets, including short updates from patrol offices and supply depots. By mapping signal patterns, she learned when German traffic peaked and when civilian transmissions dominated. She noted intervals, identified pulse signatures from different teleprinters, and understood which lines were susceptible to misrouting. To her, the city's wiring became a battlefield of rhythms, beats of electricity traveling through copper veins. Her tactical understanding showed her something crucial. She did not need to break into German headquarters to interfere with their communications. She only needed access to one weak link in a sprawling network. But to exploit it, she needed more than observation. She needed a tool capable of shaping impulses with precision. That brought her to the third angle, one defined not by courage or tactics, but by machine logic itself. Teleprinters in the early 1940s operated using mechanical electrical pulses, short, distinct bursts that corresponded to characters using standardized codes like Baudot. These pulses were picked up, processed, and interpreted by receiving machines. A malfunctioning line might print nonsense. A misrouted signal might duplicate or redirect a message. In competent hands, even a minor disturbance could have meaningful consequences. The Germans trusted their teleprinter networks because they trusted the machines. What they did not anticipate was that an ordinary office typewriter, damaged, discarded, partially stripped of parts, could be converted into a crude signaling device. Her insight came from examining the internal mechanisms. The typewriter's key bars, when pressed, moved metal arms that could be fitted with improvised contacts. She soldered thin wires to these arms, allowing each keystroke to close a simple circuit. With adjustments to tension and timing, she created a limited set of electrical pulses, not enough to create full teleprinter characters, but enough to mimic routing flags understood by older junctions. She built a tuning system using scavenged parts, springs from spare machines, bits of copper she flattened by hand, even fragments of carbon paper used to dampen excessive vibration. The device did not look like a teleprinter. It was not meant to. It was meant to masquerade as scrap while performing the work of a covert switch. Her machine could do three things: flag a message for duplication, redirect a message into a parallel channel, delay the routing sequence by milliseconds, enough to confuse certain busy exchange boards. None of these actions looked like sabotage. They resembled normal malfunctions, and malfunction was common in wartime Paris. Her technological angle determined the scale of what she could achieve. She could not rewrite German orders. She could not forge field reports, but she could intercept, reroute, or stall communications long enough for resistance units to exploit the gaps. This combination of human resolve, tactical clarity, and technological ingenuity set the stage for the decisive moment she would soon face, when a single German message, misrouted at the right second, could shift the fate of operations around Paris. For the German administration in Paris, the danger of communication failure seemed abstract. Their focus lay on the Eastern Front, on supply shortages, on partisan activity in rural regions, not on the quiet interior of a Parisian apartment building. German signals officers knew the risks of radio interception. They knew the Allies monitored airwaves, but teleprinter lines, buried in walls and disguised beneath decades of French infrastructure, appeared inherently secure. The occupation's confidence wasn't born from arrogance alone. It came from precedent. During the early years of the war, Germany's use of wired communication had proven stable. Technical manuals insisted that physical access was the primary threat. Cut cables, explosives, or sabotage teams. They prepared for such attacks. What they did not prepare for was subtle manipulation hidden beneath ordinary noise in the system. In their view, the French PTT workers posed minimal risk. Guards monitored buildings, supervised shifts limited unsanctioned access, and most importantly, communications were layered, military lines atop civilian lines, with dedicated routes for sensitive traffic. But these layers were imperfect in practice. Repairs were delayed. Spare parts were scarce. Old junctions remained in service out of necessity. Rising German paranoia should have driven more inspections, but 1943 brought new priorities: Allied bombing raids, troop withdrawals, and crises from the Eastern Front. Signal units were understaffed. Engineers were exhausted. Many were pulled from Paris to reinforce communications nearer the coast. They believed the French would not dare tamper with systems so integral to their own lives. In their confidence, they overlooked the one threat they couldn't track: a woman who understood their wiring better than they did. Her ability to read the enemy's habits exposed another angle: the moral weight of her decisions and the stakes behind every pulse she sent through the line. Resistance work often involved direct action, sabotage, armed ambushes, or courier duties with clear, immediate consequences, but her work lived in ambiguity. Each signal she manipulated could influence German troop deployments, supply movements, or patrol routes. And each influence, however small, carried a moral dimension she could never fully measure. If she rerouted a message delaying a patrol, resistance members might escape arrest. If she duplicated a supply order, partisans might intercept a convoy. If she misdirected an internal report, German officers might investigate innocent workers instead of the intended target. Electrical pulses did not discriminate. They did not reveal the human cost that followed them, and she had no control over how the resistance would use the information she extracted or distorted. Her work blurred the boundary between defense and danger, between saving lives and inadvertently placing others at risk. She lived with this uncertainty daily. Her moral struggle intensified when German retaliation grew more brutal. After a series of sabotage actions in late 1943, they conducted mass arrests. She recognized that some disruptions she had caused, small delays, duplicated wires, or misrouted packets, may have contributed to confusion that pushed the Germans toward harsher measures. She could not prove it, but the possibility haunted her. Yet she continued. Not out of ideology alone, but out of necessity. The occupation's violence increased regardless of her actions. Silence, she understood, would not protect Paris. Precision and restraint were her only tools, so she intervened rarely, choosing targets carefully, acting only when consequences seemed clear enough to justify action. This moral tension formed the quiet backdrop to her work, shaping the discipline she maintained as she approached the most critical moment of her life, a moment defined by timing rather than morality. And that timing was everything, as shown in another crucial angle of her story: how fragile wartime communication truly was. Wartime communication systems appeared structured: charts, circuits, routing hierarchies and codes, but beneath their polished diagrams lay a fragile reality. Machines jammed, wires corroded, dust entered switchboards, offices lacked replacement parts, even trained technicians misinterpreted signals during long, exhausting shifts. German officers trusted the system because it looked organized on paper. In practice, it was a patchwork held together by habit and hope. She understood this better than anyone. She knew that a message delayed by even 0.3 seconds at a busy junction could be routed into a secondary queue. A duplicated flag could be dismissed as switchboard noise. A redirected packet could sit unnoticed for minutes, an eternity when coordinating troop movements or security sweeps. German engineers blamed faults on agging French infrastructure or careless clerks. They rarely suspected intentional intervention. This blind spot created the single greatest advantage in her favor. A small malfunction looked like nothing at all, especially in a city struggling to maintain basic services. She leveraged this structural fragility with care. She did not sabotage entire lines. She did not break systems. Instead, she introduced slight irregularities at precise moments, just enough to create confusion without revealing her hand. It was a subtle art. Too much interference drew attention. Too little changed nothing. This balance between influence and invisibility became the core of her strategy. And it was this strategy that placed her at the center of a pivotal moment. One night in Paris, when a German message, misrouted at precisely the right second, would shift the course of local operations. Midnight. The corridors of the Paris administrative block are quiet, too quiet. Most officers have retired to their quarters, leaving only a skeleton crew awake, and even they move with the slow, dulled rhythm of men who believe the war is already won. That arrogance is her camouflage. In her small apartment 2 floors above the German teleprinter junction, she sits before the broken typewriter. The machine she rebuilt wire by wire, key by key. The lamplight flickers. Dust floats in the air like ash. She begins typing. But she isn't typing words. She's typing voltages. Each keystroke sends a calculated, precise electrical pulse into the junction she's tapped. Not enough to trip an alarm. Not enough to burn a circuit, just enough to mimic the signature of a routed Wehrmacht message. First pulse. A false report of engine trouble for the first armored column. The message is subtle, believable, just a small delay, nothing more. Second pulse. A supply error logged at a depot 14 km away. The system recognizes it as routine. Third pulse. A troop redeployment order, crafted to look like it came from a commander 40 miles northeast. The entire network shudders for a moment, hesitates, then accepts the lies as truth. Within minutes, real operators in real bunkers begin reacting. A motor pool halts preparation. A courier is delayed. A column is rerouted to a sector that does not exist. She keeps typing. Then comes the final sequence, an overload warning that causes the system to temporarily lock and reroute all priority channels through backup lines she knows are already congested. And in that single, perfect moment of confusion, the German armored group outside Paris loses synchronized communication. To commanders, it looks like a technical mishap. To her, it is a victory, clean, silent, untraceable. She leans back, exhausted, listening to the faint echoes of boots clattering in distant hallways as operators scramble to diagnose the sudden glitch. By dawn, she will vanish into the waking streets like a ghost. But the damage is already done. When dawn crept over Paris, it brought with it the usual grey haze of occupation, truck engines grumbling awake, patrols rotating, officers barking clipped orders in doorways. But beneath that morning routine pulsed an unusual tension. Something had gone wrong. Something big. Reports filtered through Wehrmacht channels. Armored units had failed to mobilize on schedule. 2 columns had arrived at the same junction, blocking each other entirely. A supply convoy rerouted in the night had ended up in a dead zone with no instructions. Communications logs showed discrepancies, but no culprit. The Germans blamed equipment failure. They blamed French humidity. They blamed incompetence. But they never blamed sabotage, not because it was impossible, but because it was unthinkable. After all, who could infiltrate a hardened teleprinter network? She walked through the streets that morning like any Parisian woman, coat drawn tight, head lowered. She bought bread from a vendor, she paused at a tram stop, she appeared utterly ordinary. Yet her work from the night before had rippled outward. Across the city, resistance cells heard whispers. The tanks didn't move. The Germans scrambled for hours. There was chaos at the depot. No one knows what happened. Some said it was luck. Some said it was divine intervention. Some claimed a saboteur had blown a transformer. But the truth stayed with her alone. Her operation, careful, surgical, invisible, had taught the French resistance something profound. You didn't need explosives to cripple a war machine. Sometimes, you only needed to misroute the right orders. Within weeks, more networks were studied. More lines mapped. More operators trained in the art of silent disruption, the kind that left no fingerprints. German officers began doubling their inspections, tightening protocols, demanding stricter authentication. But the seed was planted. Their greatest vulnerability wasn't steel, fuel, or men. It was information. And as long as there were people like her, patient, precise, invisible, no network in occupied France would ever be fully safe again. For the German command in Paris, the disruption of their communications network could not be ignored. Not after it delayed armored units. Not after it jammed movement schedules. Not after it caused a full night of operational paralysis. There had to be an explanation, technical, human, or otherwise. By noon the following day, the Gestapo had been notified. The Wehrmacht's Internal Signals Office launched an immediate audit. They combed through routing logs, examined the mechanical counters, and ran faults on every teleprinter relay between the Rue des Saussiers command hub and the central Paris exchange. Nothing. The machines worked. The lines worked. The encryption wheels were aligned. Traffic analysis showed no external breach. That was the most alarming part. A failure with no cause was worse than sabotage, because it meant the system was not only compromised, but compromised quietly. By late afternoon, the first suspicion formed. An insider. Someone with access. Someone who understood procedure. Someone who could manipulate routing without leaving the usual fingerprints. The order went out. Interview every teleprinter operator, examine every station log, identify any discrepancies in personnel. Within hours, the occupation authority began creating profiles. They listed operators by shift, by age, by proximity to the communication center. They dug through work histories, background files, ration cards, anything that could explain who was near which machine at what time. They looked for a saboteur. Instead, they found an absence. No one suspicious. No one out of place. No one unaccounted for. It made the Germans even more nervous. She had spent months preparing for this exact moment. Her cover identity was not haphazard, it was constructed from fragments of real French municipal records. Her daily habits were painfully ordinary. She rode the same tram. She bought bread from the same stall. She returned to the same apartment building, always at predictable hours. Predictability was her shield. Because the Gestapo rarely hunted people who blended perfectly into their own patterns. What they couldn't know was that she never touched the communications hub directly. Her method relied on physical proximity, not infiltration. In Paris, many auxiliary routing consoles were positioned in civilian access hallways, postal annexes, or maintenance compartments. The Germans considered them low risk, monitoring only the main encryption stations. She had mapped those neglected corners, memorized the guard rotations, and timed the idle periods between signal bursts. Her tool, a repaired French-made typewriter fitted with a modified punch assembly, never entered a military facility. She carried only the punch strips tucked inside the lining of her coat. The Germans weren't looking for a courier. They were looking for a technician. They were hunting the wrong profile. When the internal audit failed, the Gestapo's counter-sabotage section took charge. They were methodical. All female operators in the district were questioned first. Women comprised a significant portion of clerical labor, and the Gestapo assumed sabotage of this nature was clerical in origin. Interrogations turned aggressive. Officers asked who lingered near telephone corridors, who left rooms unexpectedly, who avoided conversation, who seemed nervous in the last 48 hours. The answers were disappointingly mundane. Most women feared the Gestapo every day. Nervousness proved nothing. Still, the net widened. They broadened their search to postal workers, then to municipal typists, then to laundresses who serviced German uniforms because someone could have overheard something. Dozens were detained. None matched the invisible offender. The Germans grew uneasy. Because if the saboteur couldn't be found, it meant the saboteur was operating with knowledge from inside their own communications doctrine. It was easier for them to believe in a shadowy Allied-trained hacker than in an ordinary Parisian woman armed with nothing more than a damaged typewriter and an understanding of telegraph rhythm. Inside the French resistance network, her story began circulating in whispers, not her name, not her face, but her method. Someone changed the orders. No explosion, no gunfire. Just confusion. The Germans are furious. It was the first time many in the resistance truly grasped the potential of disrupting the German war machine without firing a shot. Hers was a demonstration of asymmetry, using the occupiers' dependence on order and communication as a blade against them. The Gestapo, unknowingly, reinforced her legend. Their frantic search told every Parisian that something extraordinary had happened. But despite their interrogations, their raids, their late-night arrests, they never came close. Because she was never where they were looking. She lived in the spaces between suspicion. She survived because no one imagined sabotage could be so silent. And yet, even as the Germans intensified their hunt, the consequences of her work were not over, because the disruption she caused triggered a response that would alter how the occupation itself operated. The story of a broken typewriter in a small Paris apartment is, at first glance, almost impossibly modest. No explosions, no firefights, no celebrated medals, and yet, in the quiet pulse of electrical wires, an entire world shifted. Her work reminds us that wars are not only fought on fields and skis. Wars are fought in shadows, in the rhythm of signals, in the tiny miscalculations of overconfident powers. One carefully placed misroute, one pulse through a forgotten junction, can ripple outward, delaying troops, confusing commanders, saving lives, and unsettling an occupying force that prides itself on control. In this sense, her typewriter was a weapon far more precise than a gun, and far more invisible. There is also a deeper lesson about human ingenuity and the quiet courage it takes to act when the stakes are unseen. In an age dominated by machines and codes, she became a bridge between human intuition and technological fragility. She did not seek glory. She did not crave recognition. She understood the stakes, and she acted with patience, discipline, and moral clarity, choosing when and how to intervene. Her battlefield was silent, yet its consequences were immediate, undeniable, and profoundly human. Her story also underscores the fragility of systems built on assumptions. The German occupation trusted their infrastructure, believing the machinery and wiring were safe. They never considered that understanding the subtle rhythm of those systems could be as dangerous as any armed assault. And yet, in that blind spot, one ordinary woman altered the course of events, teaching a lesson that resonates far beyond Paris in 1943, that intelligence, precision, and observation can be mightier than brute force. Finally, her story endures because it is a testament to the unseen actors of history, those whose courage and ingenuity are invisible in official accounts, yet whose actions echo through time. In the shadowed hum of a broken typewriter, she found a way to fight, to resist, and to shape history quietly, leaving the world changed without ever stepping into the light.